it was a day that millions of Egyptians thought would never come. The former president, Hosni Mubarak, in court, in a cage, on a hospital bed, as it happens, forced to answer to charges of brutality and corruption. Just a year ago, it was unimaginable. Today, though, modern Egypt's longest-serving leader, a one-time war hero, but also an unforgiving dictator, was humbled before the masses. Before we begin tonight's discussions, let's remind ourselves of that moment today in court.
I deny all of the charges.
I
deny the charges.
I deny the charges.
Mubarak and his sons there answering to charges of brutality and corruption today in court. Well, tonight I'll be asking my guests if the trial of Hosni Mubarak is necessary for Egypt to move forward and put an autocratic past behind it, or is it a dangerous distraction from reform, a trial that's merely motivated by revenge? Well, my guests tonight include, in Cairo, Akhtab Soueif. She's an Egyptian novelist and political commentator. Here with me in the studio, Geneviève Garrigos is the president of Amnesty International France. Sherine Fouti is an Egyptian-American attorney. And in California tonight, we're joined by Robert Springborg. He's the Professor of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School. And don't forget, you too can participate in tonight's debate via Facebook. Just go to the France 24 debate page and let us know your thoughts. We're very keen to hear from you. But first, I'd like to start with you tonight, Akhtab, because you were part of the revolution that brought down Hosni Mubarak. How did it feel today to see him on trial?
I think the dominant feeling was a feeling of relief, because, as you know, the revolution is still in process and it's by no means won. And so there have been, guesses and surmises for a long time as to whether the military will actually allow Mr. Mubarak to stand trial. And the fact that today did happen and the trial went ahead and that it was conducted with such decorum and it was so proper is a cause of great relief for all of us.
Is this trial important for Egypt in terms of moving forward from its autocratic past?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you've had a dictatorship that has governed this country for 30 years, that has brought the country to its knees economically and politically, that has ruled the country not in the interests of the people, and that has, killed and tortured and basically degraded public life in Egypt for a very long time. There's no way that you can leave that behind you and move forward without a reckoning, without, working out what happened and why and who's responsible, and without establishing, accountability.
Sherine Fouti, you're a lawyer, so obviously you're well versed in what was happening in court today. How important is it that this is a fair trial?
I think it's very important. If you don't have a fair trial, then there's no sort of legitimacy to back the decision that's made, and at that point that decision can be challenged by all sorts of bodies, whether internal or external. So it's very important that this be a fair trial. On the other hand, one might have problems with the fact that certain charges were not brought against Mubarak and that they were only limited to the charges that were presented today in court. We did not hear anything about the 30 years of human rights abuses that Mubarak and his regime and prior regimes were responsible for. And I'm sure that these issues will need to be addressed before there will be a true truth and reconciliation type of atmosphere assigned to this trial.
That's something I'm sure you'd agree with, Geneviève Garrigos. Mubarak presided over many trials that weren't fair, and people might argue that it's not fair that he's getting a fair trial now.
Yes, and it's also important for him to have, anyway, a trial must be fair and transparent, okay? Otherwise, it's not justice. And then it's very important because during all those last 30 years, justice has been denied to Egyptian people. And to show today that first, there is no more impunity, and the people who are responsible for very grave human rights abuses and violation are brought to court is the first important step. But to show that those people, they also have fair trial. It's also another important step because it shows that justice is back to Egypt.
All right, I can see we're getting some consensus here on the debate, but something we don't like, so I'm going to try and play devil's advocate. Robert Springborg in California, what about this idea that this is just a popular trial to appease the masses?
Well, as we've just heard, Egyptians speaking on behalf, if you will, of the masses are saying, yes, this trial is a very good thing. But if we look at the actual bill of indictment, our previous speakers have also said, in a sense, how narrow it is. And so those who have commissioned the trial, namely the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, have obviously wanted to keep the trial quite limited and indeed focused on the events at the very end of the Mubarak era, the events in which the military itself claimed to be acting as one hand with the revolutionaries, saving the nation. So the guilty parties are, it seems to me, in the eyes of the military, not themselves, but are the president, his family, and the Ministry of Interior Forces that were involved. So the military sees a win-win situation, I think. It can be exonerated of any implication in these events. It can have have bowed to the will of the revolutionaries, and then all of the other matters in which the military might have been complicit, including economic crimes of various sorts, will be swept away and no one will look at them. So I think there's a strategic calculation here on the part of those orchestrating the trial that this can reinforce their position rather than undermine it.
Adaf Swef, this is obviously a very emotional trial for a lot of people in Egypt, but is there a risk that people have become too fixated on what happens to Mubarak and they're not, as Robert Stromberg just pointed out, focusing on other members of the regime, some of whom are still, of course, in power?
I'm sorry, could you give me that again? Too fixated on what's happening to Mubarak?
To Mubarak, what's happening to him as an individual rather than what's happening to the lower rank and file. Some of those
that's
people
completely not true. Absolutely not. I think everybody really is very well aware of the whole picture. Everybody is thinking and talking both about the tops, the capos of the regime, and of, what happens as you go further and further down the sort of feeding chain, and also the implications for SCAF, for the military council, and the gamble that they've taken in permitting this trial to go ahead. And that was really, for example, this issue of whether SCAF permitted it or didn't, this was why there were these protests continuing on the street and why Tahrir was occupied until it was emptied by force 2 days ago. As pressure to make them bring Mubarak into the dock. So people are not fixated on what happens to Mubarak. It's a very important moment. It's a very symbolic moment, but it also is a great victory because without it, it would be, you would have lots of arguments for not tackling the people beneath, because everybody would always say that it had come from Mubarak personally. So it's a completely necessary thing to happen, but it's not, of course, enough. But it had to happen for the country to clean itself up and move forward. And the military council are taking a risk because already several people have called, several of the litigants have called for Field Marshal Tantawi to give evidence, and everybody knows that the military have got issues to do with business interests and so on. So that's all there. It's all boiling. And also, I just wanted to say that the charge sheet was indeed limited, but all the requests that the lawyers for the people who are putting themselves in there as as civil litigants were much wider. So we can see this sort of opening out. Just
a quick question, Adaf, should he face the death penalty?
Well, this is a matter of personal opinion. I think that a fair trial could not fail to deliver the death penalty. I'm personally against the death penalty, and I would personally believe, and I think a lot of people believe like me, that the trial should be completely fair, should be completely open, and it will result in a death sentence which can then be remitted or revoked, and he can spend the rest of his... I'm against capital punishment anyway.
Geneviève, what are your views on that? What's Amnesty's position on that?
Of course, it's the same. It means that we cannot imagine that the sentence will be death penalty, because then it will get to come
But that's
back.
the punishment for these crimes in Egypt.
Yes, but you know, when you are in a time for change, you have to go to really for change, and to abolish death penalty and not to use in this particular case will be another good example. And for us, it's impossible that, and we are mobilized not for him to have death penalty. Yeah.
Showing, what are your thoughts on this?
I mean, I also agree. I'm against the death penalty. I think that it would be a much stronger justice for Mubarak to sit in jail for the rest of his life, however limited that may be, given his health conditions. But to face that and to have to think about every day all of the problems that he caused for so many people and in their lives, how many people he killed, in terms of enlisting change, I think that could be a positive move to abolish the death penalty, but at the same time we do have to respect, to some extent, I think a very important issue here is sovereignty of Egypt, and that has been compromised to such an enormous extent in the past several years.
In terms of Mubarak receiving support from other nations?
Exactly. And principally, we can see not just Mubarak, but his entire regime has received immense support from both the American and other European bodies, as well as the Saudi Arabian governments. And specifically the army itself and the Supreme Council of the Army has received and has continually represented foreign interests in Egypt to the detriment of Egyptian sovereignty and Egyptian interests. And until this issue is addressed, and until...
So should there be an apology from the White House, from Britain, from France for supporting Mubarak all these years?
I think, well, that's one thing, but we can see very clearly how the White House changed their position during the time of the uprisings, from we support Mubarak 100%, and then within the next couple of days, Joe Biden just completely changing to, oh, Mubarak's a horrible dictator, he must leave. They're acting in the American interests. They, if we look at their record and their funding of NGOs that are designed to kind of infiltrate the system and support American interests rather than Egyptian interests and real change and real reform, this is a problem. This is the essential problem at the center of Egypt right now, and until that changes, there's not going to be a real revolution. It's only going to be the same continuation of the same system.
With a different face at the top of the regime. Robert Springborg, there's been some interesting parallels drawn today, one of which with the Libyan leader, Muammar Gaddafi, because there are noises being made in Europe that he's going to be allowed to stay on in Libya despite all the innocent people who have died at the hands of his regime, whereas here's Hosni Mubarak, who stepped down somewhat voluntarily. He agreed to step down, and now he's facing the death penalty. Is that fair?
Well, I don't think either of these two gentlemen deserve much so-called fairness. But no, it does clearly send the wrong message that if you're intransigent and engage in brutality against your own people as long as you possibly can, then we'll come to terms with you and you can just go retire somewhere, and that's the end of the story. So I think these overtures to Gaddafi by outside parties, most notably the European ones, are absolutely wrong-headed. And the egregious abuses of Gaddafi far exceed those of Mubarak, and the fact that they are sort of suggesting that even some members of his family who have been involved in the violent oppression of demonstrators and now those fighting against them is taking Europe and anyone else who's on this side of it down a very wrong path indeed. And so justice would require, certainly for Gaddafi, that he go to the International Criminal Court. And I would have thought, personally, yes, I appreciate Egyptian sovereignty, and it's very good that they're trying him. To be honest, though, I would rather empower the International Criminal Court to deal with all of these cases And then it sends a message to everybody around the world, including to those in Western capitals, that violations of the law will be dealt with in an internationally constituted body that has international legitimacy and whose procedures and so on are sort of beyond question. But I appreciate the sovereignty issues involved, but I'd rather elevate the International Criminal Court.
And who fails to try certain members based on which countries they come from. I mean, I think that as an international lawyer, I think the International Criminal Court is a fantastic idea. Should it apply equal-handedly its standards to everyone in the entire world? But we've seen countless times that it's been leaders of African nations that have been tried, and not those of either Western countries or
what about Serbian
allies.
Serbian war criminals have been tried
In the ICTY.
You think that the ICC is biased?
I think so. I mean, look, for example, at the attacks.
But America, of course, doesn't sign up to it for one thing.
They haven't, but for example, Israel, in the aftermath of the attacks on Gaza, no question whatsoever of whether they could be brought before the ICC, even though their violations were actions were in grave violation of international law. I find this a very biased approach on the part of the ICC. That's solely focused on those of poor nations, dictators in poor nations, rather than equal-handedly applying the policies of the court.
What are your thoughts on that, Geneviève?
Yeah, I don't agree. I'm sorry, because of course we can see that most of the case, most of the cases handled today by the International Criminal Court are from Africa. But except the case of Sudan, the other cases, the country themselves, they have been asking to the court for help because they weren't able to handle by themselves the justice in their country. It means it's not the court that has decided that.
Would the ICC be better placed to try Mubarak than would the Egyptian
No,
courts?
The idea of justice is, first, if the country itself can handle the justice, is by far better, because it's really very important. The people in the country, they have the right also to the truth, to the reparation, etc. When it is not possible, okay, then it has to go to the International Court. And what has been very courageous from the Security Council was to call the prosecutor of the International Court to make its investigation on Gaddafi. But we can see that there are differences, because today with Bashar al-Assad in Syria, nothing happens. And what is happening today in Syria is the same level than what's happening in Libya. Then there are differences.
Okay.
But it's building.
Okay, all right, we're going to have to end on that note. We're just going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll have the headlines for you and the rest of tonight's debate. Don't go away.